Okay, our next speaker is Catholic Family News editor John Vennari. He's going to speak about the malice of revolutionary men. And the reason John talks, he has a tremendous range of lectures and talks on so many topics. He's like the right kind of encyclopedia, not the wrong kind. But today he has chosen to speak about this because, as we said in our publications, that in our culture has changed in the past 50 years. If you go back 50 years and you look at where we are today versus where we were 50 years ago, at least as a culture, it's night and day. And John is going to address how did this happen, and he's basically going to lay out for you how these revolutionary men, as he calls them, which is what they really were, got into, it's almost like total saturation. So I'm not going to say too much. He has many brilliant lectures on rock music and what it does to kids' mind. There's so much. Maybe we will put that on our website for the Buffalo Regional Right to Life Committee so you can access the talks that John has, because they are just highly educational. So without talking anymore, John is going to talk to you about revolutionary men, the malice of revolutionary men.
I'd like to thank Stacy for the invitation and for the introduction. Yuri Bezmenov was a Russian KGB agent who was assigned to India. He defected in 1970 and he came to the United States in 1984. And at that time, in 1984, he gave an interview to Edward Griffin in which he explained how Soviet communists set up the subversion of a country. And when we hear what Bezmenov has to say, I think we can see the results of the subversion in the United States right now. And one of the ways we see the effects of this subversion is in the presidential election of 2008. Yes, we can. So in 1984, Bezmenov told Edward Griffin that from what he could see, and this is also, he said, the observations of other Soviet defectors of his caliber, only 15% of Soviet agents' activity, only 15% of the time, the money, and the manpower of Soviet agents, say, working in a country such as the United States, only 15% of that is spent on espionage. 15. The remaining 85% of the time, money, and manpower of Soviet agents is dedicated to what he calls ideological subversion or psychological warfare. And the purpose of the psychological warfare, this ideological subversion, is to change the perception of reality in America. Those are his words. And that means that despite the abundance of information that's out there concerning the truth, no one or few people are able to come to sensible conclusions. Now, he says there are a number of stages in this ideological subversion. The first stage is demoralization. And his definition of the word is a little bit different from what you might think it is. We're going to talk about that at length. The second stage is destabilization, and this is where the essentials of society, economy, foreign relations, defense systems are set up more in line with the Marxist-Leninist principles. And that, too, he said, was pretty much complete in 1985, because he said the demoralization was complete by 1984. The third stage is an orchestrated crisis, the results of which will bring people under a big brother Marxist-style government. And he says that when conditions are right, this crisis can be pulled off in about 4 to 6 weeks. But I'm not going to talk about the other two stages. I want to talk about the first stage because it's the most important. The process of what Yuri Bezmenov called demoralization. And this process, he says, takes about 25 years. Now, why does it take 25 years? He answers. He says, because this is the minimum number of years required to educate one generation of your enemy, to expose them, to condition them to accept the ideology of the enemy. In other words, Bezmenov said, Marxist-Leninist ideology is being, this is his words, being pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students without being counterbalanced by the basic values of American patriotism. Now, I know some here in this might say, I mean, what relevance does this have now? The Soviet Union has collapsed. It's all over. Well, the point is the Soviet Union doesn't have to exist anymore. The damage is done. And the breakup of the Soviet Union in the 1980s, which there's evidence it's part of an even greater plan, which I can't go into right now, a bigger global plan, the breakup of the Soviet Union has nothing to do with the fact that great swaths of American youth, especially from colleges and universities, have been trained for nearly 50 years and are still being indoctrinated according to left-wing, socialist, politically correct ideologies, principles that are against objective reality, against the natural moral law, against divine law. The widespread left-wing politically correct ideology that now dominates American higher education would not have been possible without this intellectual demoralization that Bezmenov talked about in 1984. And the election of the pagan left-wing agitator, otherwise known as Barack Obama, would not have been possible without this intellectual demoralization that Bezmenov talked about in 1984. As a Soviet agent, Bezmenov was told, and I'm using his words, he was told by his superiors, never bother with the leftists. That is, in other words, if you're a Soviet agent, you come into the country, you find leftists already there, don't bother with them. He was told by the Soviet leaders, never bother with these political prostitutes. He says, aim higher. That was my instruction. Try to get into larger circulation. Go after conservative media. Reach filthy rich movie makers, intellectuals in so-called academic circles. Recruit to your cause cynical, egocentric people who can look into your eyes with an angelic expression and tell you a lie. These are the most recruitable people, people who lack moral principles. Again, I've just described Barack Obama minus the angelic expression. Now, these people serve up to destabilize a nation. And in 1984, Bezmenov said this is very important. He says, so basically, America is stuck. The results you can see. Most of these people who graduated in the 1960s, dropouts and half-baked intellectuals, are now, 1984, now occupying positions of power in the government, civil services, businesses, mass media, and education system. You are stuck with them. You can't get rid of them. They are contaminated. They are programmed to think and react according to a certain stimuli and a certain pattern. You can't change their mind. And this is interesting. He says, even if you prove that white is white and black is black, you still cannot change their basic perception and the logic of the behavior. In other words, for these people, the process of demoralization is complete and irreversible. To rid society of these people, you need another 15 to 20 years to educate a new generation of patriotically minded and common sense people who will be acting in favor in the interest of United States society. Now remember, he said this in 1984, more than 25 years ago. And back then he said we need to educate a new generation of patriotically minded and common sense people. Well, that has not happened. Everything has gotten progressively and unspeakably worse, and I'm going to detail that a little bit later on. But Bezmenov, a Soviet agent who knew the process of demoralization, remember, he did this as a Soviet agent in India. Bezmenov said the demoralization process in the United States is basically complete for the last 25 years. 84, he says this. Actually, he says it's overfulfilled, because demoralization now reaches such areas where not even Comrade Andropov and all his experts would even dream of such tremendous success. Most of it is done by Americans to Americans, thanks to the lack of moral standards. As I mentioned before, exposure to true information does not matter anymore. A person who is demoralized is unable to assess true information. We've all run into that, trying to show someone that white is white and black is black, and they say, well, like that's like your way of saying things. There's just no connection. But his are staggering statements. He says most of the demoralization is done by Americans to Americans. In other words, don't look for Soviet agents in university classrooms or the entertainment media or in government or in MTV, a principal vehicle of subversion, rock music and the pop culture, which I don't have time to go into. But the socialist antichrist mindset, because it is antichrist, the socialist antichrist mindset now permeates the minds of many who occupy positions in these institutions. You don't need Soviet agents anymore. It was true in '84. It's even more true now. And then he says, exposure to true information, I'm repeating, does not matter anymore. A person who is demoralized is unable to assess true information. We now have a generation, and we've had it for quite some time, who are ruled by feeling and emotion, not by reason. And in the end, we have young people coming out of colleges and universities who think that they're educated, but they are not. They are not educated. They are trained. They are trained for the workforce, trained to be computer scientists, trained in business skills, trained in marketing and how to sell soap and perfume and insurance. But they are not educated. St. Thomas Aquinas defines education as the making of the new man up to the point of virtue. That's education. But the modern young man, and not so young anymore, the average modern man is, as the brilliant Evelyn Wall noted, the average modern man is a small part of a man pretending to be the whole. They are not educated in objective moral ethics or in the basics of human nature. They aren't given a proper understanding of human nature. The so-called humanities, arts, literature courses have been taken over by maniacs who use it as a vehicle to pump the most left-wing, feminist, pro-abortion, pro-socialist, pro-homosexual, environmental, politically correct sewage into the mind of the students. And the sad part is, especially those going into university, most of these students have no defense because their grade schools and their high schools, especially in the public schools, Catholic schools too now, were often imbued with the same kind of modern indoctrination. They have no defense against these left-wing ideologies, no real education in logic or in critical thinking, little or no understanding of the existence of objective reality or the natural law. In fact, for the most part, natural law is denied. I want to talk about natural law a little later on. The great Thomistic philosopher, Father Austin Woodbury, as far back as the 50s, 60s, and 70s, he called many modern college students de-educated monsters. That was his term, de-educated monsters. Now, am I insulting the young people? Am I saying that young people of our generation are incapable of being properly educated? No, it means that these young people have been swindled out of a true education and paid through the nose for it, paying student loans for 15, 20 years. And they have had their minds warped by revolutionary principles, again, that are contrary to reason, contrary to natural law, contrary to divine law. This all too often, we've all seen it, it's what modern education produces. I'll give you some examples. My friend Ed Faust, he's a writer for Catholic Family News, magnificent writer. He worked for over 20 years in the Atlantic City Press, which was the main secular press daily and Sunday in the Atlantic City region in New Jersey. And he says, this is again, after working there over 20 years, the vast majority of everyone who works at the press is a fellow traveler of left-wing agenda, pro-abortion, pro-homosexual, pro-democratic party, global warming hysteria. You would think it was the second coming when Bill Clinton was elected. I mean, they were uncorking their best champagne. But here's what Ed wrote on the subject. He wrote this last June in Catholic Family News. It's quite revealing. He says, journalists, as newspaper hacks like to be called, are usually the product of J schools, that is, of journalism departments at universities. I never attended such an institution, but its graduates have provided me with a fairly accurate idea of the general program of study. Reporters arrive in the newsroom with diplomas, sometimes master's degrees, from J School, and then file their first story, revealing that whatever they learned did not include the rudiments of grammar, punctuation, spelling, and syntax. Many are incapable of writing a decent sentence. He's worked with these people for 20 years. He told me stories for 20 years about this. They graduated journalism school. Many are incapable of writing a decent sentence, nor is their ability to form or understand a logical argument manifested. So what did they learn in school? Attitudes. Attitudes. J School students, I'm still quoting Faust, J School students have been drilled in a handful of politically correct attitudes that color their perception of the world. They see everything, almost unconsciously, through the lens of liberalism and never consider that a dissenting view might have some claim to their attention and respect. So you see, journalists are trained to have the quote-unquote right attitudes. Camille Paglia, writing last September, she's a feminist, she's leftist, but I like reading her. She has a certain amount of common sense. And she said, elite education in the United States has become a frenetic assembly line of competitive college application to schools where ideological brainwashing is so pandemic that it's invisible. That's a profound statement. That's profound. So pandemic, it's invisible. I don't know if anyone saw Evan Coyne Maloney's magnificent DVD documentary about modern education. It's called Indoctrinate You. And he interviews a Professor David Clemens of Monterey Peninsula College. And Clemens speaks about those in the highest echelons of education who set the agenda for the school. Here's what Clemens says. He's talking about teachers. He says, the prevailing attitude was to go along to get along. No one wanted to take on this group. They feared reprisals, so teachers would find some cockamamie way of satisfying them. Then he holds up a sheet of paper. He says, this is a course outline that every teacher has to develop if you're going to propose a new class. And then he quotes from the outline. Include a description of how the course topics are treated to develop a knowledge and understanding of race, class, and gender issues. And Clemens says that's all classes. That's not just sociology or political science. It applies to physics if you're teaching physics. It applies to mathematics. He says, I have a friend here teaching ornamental horticulture. And she had to explain how she was going to develop a knowledge of race, class, and gender issues in her class on succulent gardens. This is the lunacy that we've come to. And Clemens goes on to comment how this is a gross violation of academic standards and even an affront to the most superficial understanding of academic freedom. Because if you don't go along with this nonsense, which he put up a bit of a stink, he says, I was cast as the predictable racist, sexist, homophobe. But then he said, and this is revealing, he says, if you can get students persuaded of a couple of basic ideas about the nature of reality, and in this case he's talking about a warped sense of reality, you can go a long way towards succeeding in a social engineering process in which you are engaged. It's exactly what modern education is, hotbeds of politically correct left-wing indoctrination. David Horowitz and Jacob Laskin, they recently published this book here, The One-Party Classroom, How Radical Professors at America's Top College Indoctrinate Students and Undermine Our Democracy. It documents this extensively, and it's not pick and choose. It's an across-the-board study that encompasses universities throughout the country, Duke University, University of Chicago, Columbia, Penn State, University of Texas, University of Arizona, Temple University in Philadelphia, University of Missouri. The list goes on. And the authors document that modern universities indoctrinate their students in the following. One is I'm not going to list them all here, but some of them. One is the promoting of Marxist approach as key understanding to human societies, but they're careful never to mention the bloody legacy of this of Marxist doctrine, and no mention of the total collapse in the real world of the societies these Marxist principles founded. They show the students are indoctrinated in instilling ideas that racism is enforced by vicious white male patriarchy. And the goal of us white male patriarchs is to suppress people of color and other marginalized groups. This is what you're paying your students, your children to learn. It requires, across the bend, it requires students to believe that gender is not a biological characteristic, but a socially created aspect of human behavior designed by men to oppress women. I didn't know we were that powerful, but I guess we are. Now, the list, of course, one atrocious course after another. Towards the end of the book, they list all these silly gender courses and things. But anyway, the sad thing, of course, is, and many of you know this, that Catholic colleges and universities are no better since the revolution, the modernist revolution of the Second Vatican Council. In fact, they're worse. And the reason they're worse is, what do? Rather than it just being a left-wing ideology, environmentalism, feminism, all that business, they cloak it with this counterfeit spiritual imperative. That's why the modernist Catholic universities are even worse. Now, a problem, of course, and I think you all know this, does not merely lie with higher education. As I touched upon already, the grade schools, public schools, have been dumbing down students for decades. This is documented. I need two hands to lift this. This is documented in this hefty tome by Charlotte Thomas Isobert called The Dumbing Down of America. I missed a key word. The deliberate dumbing down of America. Charlotte Isobert, she was senior policy advisor in the Office of Educational Research and Improvement in the U.S. Department of Education under the first Reagan administration. She's seen it from the inside at the highest level. She knows what she's talking about, and she spends 600 pages documenting the deliberate dumbing down of America as government-directed educational policy. Now, the book merits a talk by itself. The book, by the foreword was written by Samuel Blumenfeld. He wrote The Closing of the American Mind, I think. But what she documents in her book is that the real purpose of today's American education is, again, she has a longer list, I'll just give you some of them, to use the schools to change America from a free individual nation to a socialist global state, just one of the many socialist states that will be subservient to the United Nations Charter and not the Constitution. To reject American values in favor of internationalist values, to reject freedom to choose one's own career in favor of a totalitarian K through 12 outcome-based education process called, very revealing title, Limited Learning for Lifelong Labor. That's what they call it. And you sign up for it. Oh, I want limited learning. And this is coordinated through the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. And the most important, to reject, they're trained to reject objective truth and moral absolutes in favor of tolerance, situation ethics, and consensus. And Isobert work seems to tally with that of this writer here, John Taylor Gatto. He's a New York, Gatto, I think you pronounce it. Gatto, yes. He's a New York educator. He wrote the book, Dumbing Us Down, The Hidden Curriculum of Compulsory Schooling. And both Isobert and Gatto point out that this deliberate dumbing down in American education has really been going on since at least the 1920s. The work of the Soviet agents later on in the United States that was spoken of by Bezmenov, it's exacerbated and sped up the process, but it was going on even before the Soviets got here. And also, we have to admit, even at our best in the 20th century U.S. education, we are so far behind the medievals, say 13th century Europe. Dante Alighieri, I hope everybody knows who he is. He wrote the Divine Comedy. 13th century Italy. Dante Alighieri. Do you know what his grade school education was? And this was typical for 13th century Italy. It was the classic trivium. In elementary school, as a young boy, Dante learned grammar, syntax, poetry, rhetoric, and Latin classics. He mastered the moral lessons of the distichs of Cato and of Aesop's fables, and as a grade school boy, he had the entire 150 Psalms of David committed to memory in Latin. This was typical. That's education. It's the trivium where the young people first learn grammar, logic, and rhetoric so they can think clearly, write correctly, and speak and argue competently. And that's what the medievals learned first. And then the facts of history, geography, science, that was all, and their minds are so well developed because they had the proper formation. They just brought it all in. They just pulled it all in. So we are so maimed in this country, we don't even know what education is. But the end result of all this dumbing down, which comes not only from education, but as I said, the modern pop culture of rock music and entertainment, is a generation of what 26-year-old Jason Matera called Obama zombies. And Jason Matera, who is now the editor of Human Events, he just published a book with that as its title, Obama Zombies, How the Liberal Machine Brainwashed My Generation. He talks about how Obama's empty rhetoric, left-wing ideology, and pop star status completely mesmerized his generation. Young people and college students were one of Obama's largest voting blocs. Their starstruck reaction to the unqualified junior senator was all emotion over reason, all feelings and pop culture over objective reality. You have to quote some of these people. Matera quotes Mark Burmester, a young Obama supporter, and he says, hey, having a hip candidate like him makes it difficult to support anybody else. I mean, Barack Obama's in style, so if you don't support Barack, it's like you're not in style. Oh, well, thanks. These people shouldn't be allowed to vote. Male student from Garden Center in New York. He was outside MTV studio when Barack Obama made his appearance there prior to the election. He said, the way he makes you feel, it's like when you're going up to pick up a date for the first time. This is a politician they're talking about. On election night, November 2008, after Obama's victory had been announced, throngs of students at Maine's Bowdoin College huddled in a circle. They were holding hands. They held their hands up to the sky. They collectively wept and bowed their heads and sang Amazing Grace. Now the election of Obama was a religious experience for these poor souls. And one young lady, as part of the throngs outside the White House on election night, was blissfully holding an Obama balloon. And she proclaimed that Barack Obama was going to bring peace to everybody in the world. I mean, I could go on with example after pathetic example. And Jason Matera does that in his book. But what we see with this generation of Obama zombies, it's a great name, is an unwarranted adoration of a left-wing politician, an enthusiastic love affair with an anti-Christ candidate. Left-wing, right-wing really doesn't say what he is. An anti-Christ candidate who is the most pro-abortion, and we just got a description of abortion, pro-abortion, pro-homosexualist candidate the country has yet to produce. So what we see in this is the triumph of the leftist indoctrination from our schools, media, and pop culture. Now, Jason Matera's book is very good for the assemblance of facts. I learned a lot from it. He has a fascinating chapter about the Obama campaign machine's brilliant use of the internet and Facebook and YouTube. I mean, it was really quite spectacular. And to his credit, he is aggressively going after the people in his generation. He's really trying to speak to them. But I'm sad to say that I can't recommend Matera's book without reservation, and one of them being is Matera's use throughout the book of bad language, which there's really no excuse for. I mean, how can you be a young conservative claiming to restore traditional values and pepper your book with bad language? Sometimes it's him speaking, sometimes he's quoting somebody. And the book suffers from another defect, And that is what Matera proposes as a solution. And I'm not just picking on Matera because I see this often on our side. What he proposes as the conservative solution to take the country back are freedom, liberty, capitalism, democracy, traditional values. Well, in the face of the evil we now face, I really find these slogans a bit shallow. They're rather inadequate because I think we need to go deeper than that and higher than that, not necessarily to use on the political campaign, but for our own stability. We need to go deeper, and that we have to develop an understanding of the natural law, and we have to go higher, and that we have to develop and cling to our understanding of divine law. These are the ultimate arbiters of right and wrong, and not merely a vague notion of freedom and democracy. For example, in the book, God bless him, he's talking about socialists, and he says, hey, socialists, you want to spread your doctrine? Fine, we believe in freedom. Well, there is no moral right to do what's morally wrong. You have the physical freedom to do it, but you don't have the moral freedom. In any event, so what I want to contribute at this point may not be what you were expecting today, because it's for others to concentrate on political solutions, political parties, various forms of activism. I'm all for it. Do it. Run with it. But what I want to spend time about is how we can start to ground ourselves in correct thinking and in critical thinking so that we ourselves will not only never become an Obama zombie, which I don't think would happen to anybody in this room, but neither will we become a George Bush zombie. We have to secure an understanding of the basic truths of the natural law and divine law, and this is our moral compass. And teach and instill these truths in our children so that they will become grounded in objective reality, that they see the truth for themselves and not just quote somebody else. And only then, I think, will we be effective in improving the dire situation of our country, because, point of common sense, you can't have a good society without good people in it. So, natural law. Now, Barack Obama, I'm going to quote him a little later on, but Barack Obama and way too many in our generation effectively deny the natural law. Now, to deny natural law is to sever yourself from 2,500 years of Western philosophical thought. It is to sever yourself from the Old Testament and the New Testament. It is to sever yourself from reality, and it's to make of yourself a revolutionary. The denial of the natural law is the product of confusion and the refuge of scoundrels. Now, one of the ways that Obama denies the natural law is his pandering to the homosexual lobby. I'll give some really disturbing specifics later on. Now, granted, of course, if you're a lawyer, under present circumstances, you may not be able to invoke natural law if you're trying to win a case before a judge, even if the judge is either truly impartial or a left-wing activist. But the denial of natural law will continue to break down Western civilization, and as such, we need to review the truth of it. And what I want to be giving here is some really, this is just an hors d'oeuvre. This is basic fundamentals. So what is natural law? Well, I'm going to give a more complete definition later on, but for now, we'll just define it as basically the law written on man's heart by which he knows right from wrong. And the most fundamental principle of the natural law is that we must do good and avoid evil. The natural law also applies to particulars, even those in the primitive tribes of New Guinea or the American Indian prior to their evangelization. They knew it was wrong to steal. They knew it was wrong to swindle. They knew it was wrong to lie. They knew it was wrong to hurt or kill the innocent, especially women and children. They knew it. Now, the natural law is hated because modern man does not want to accept any objective standard outside of himself. It's one of the principles of Freemasonry, that natural intelligence is the highest intelligence, and that man himself becomes God. Now, when this new thinking says man becomes God, it's not in the sense of the God that we know, that man becomes all-powerful and all-knowing and can create an entire universe out of nothing. No, man becomes God in that he becomes the sole arbiter of what is right and wrong. Everything is based on the human will, the human volition. Anything the human will wants to do, there should be a law allowing it and protecting it. If Jane wants an abortion, if Bill wants to participate in homosexual activity, because they want it, it must be allowed, they must be allowed to have it, and there must be a law both allowing it and protecting it. Again, sheer human volition, no objective standard outside of me that I either measure up to or fail to measure up to. Now, natural law gets in the way of all that. Natural law tells me I can't just do anything I want. Natural law tells politicians and judges that they can't do anything they want. Natural law is also rejected in our anti-religious age because it is claimed by academics of a certain stripe, it is claimed that natural law is nothing but the invention of Christian teachers as a apologetical proof of Christian teaching from nature. Christian teachers just made this up. Now, this is demonstrably false. These people don't know history. The concept of natural law was not invented by Christian teachers. It's been around a long time, prior to Christ. The wise men from ancient civilizations recognized and taught that there is a law written on man's heart regarding right and wrong, and we know when we have transgressed it. The ancient Greeks, Sophocles in his play Antigone. Antigone disobeyed the king's orders that her brother was not to be buried. So in the play, King Creon says to Antigone, "Were you not aware of my law prohibiting these acts?" And Antigone says, I knew about your law. And you still dared to break the law? Antigone says, "Yes. I did not believe that Zeus was the one who had proclaimed it. Neither did justice or the gods of the dead whom justice lives among. The laws they made for men are well marked out. I didn't suppose your decree had strength enough, or you, who are human, to violate the lawful traditions the gods have not merely written, but made infallible. These laws are not for now or for yesterday. They are alive forever, and no one knows when they were shown to us first." Okay? Sophocles was not a Christian. He was a pagan. He lived 500 years before Christ. He's writing about the reality of natural law. Aristotle, again, 500 years before Christ, he said, one part of what is politically just is natural, the other part is legal. What is natural has the same validity everywhere alike, independent of its seeming so or not. And then he says, there is in nature a common principle of the just and the unjust that all people in some way discern, even if they have no association or commerce with each other. Again, Aristotle, not a Christian, he was a pagan, writing, teaching natural law. Cicero, Marcus Tullius Cicero, lived 50 years before Christ. He described law as the highest reason implanted by nature, which commands what ought to be done and forbids the opposite. And Cicero would also say right is based not upon men's opinions, but upon nature. Again, Cicero was not a Christian. He was a pagan, teaching natural law. We have the witnesses from pre-Christian nations that natural law exists. It is not a Christian invention. But of course, we have Christian teachers who also speak of the existence of natural law. The greatest authority is who? Is St. Paul. St. Paul, chapter 2, letter to the Romans. For when the Gentiles have not the law, do by nature, we talk about the Mosaic law here, for when the Gentiles who have not the law do by nature those things that are of the law, these having not the law are a law unto themselves, who shew the work of the law written in their hearts. So we know from divine revelation, through the epistle of St. Paul, that there is a natural moral law written on man's hearts, and we know we have transgressed it, even before the gospel is brought to us. And this is not a particularly Catholic concept. Professor John P. McNeill, a Protestant from the Union Theological Seminary, he points out that all the 16th century Protestant reformers accepted this teaching. Here he's speaking of Luther, Melanchthon, Zwingli, Duns, and Calvin. He says not one of the leaders of the Reformation espoused the principle of the natural law. Instead, with the possible exception of Zwingli, they all on occasion expressed a quite ungrudging respect for the moral law implanted in the human heart and seek to inculcate this attitude in their readers. For the reformers, as for the fathers, canonists, and scholastics, natural law stood affirmed on the pages of Scripture. Now, of course, the great master of explaining natural law to us is St. Thomas Aquinas, because St. Thomas Aquinas answers the question, if natural law is written on man's heart, then who was it who originally did the writing? Who was it that wrote on man's heart? And Aquinas answers by his definition, which he explains as a rule of reason promulgated by God in man's nature, whereby man can discern how he should act. Aquinas is the most systematic explanation. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. It follows with his, after his explanation of divine law. But he says in this Summa, he says natural law is nothing else than the rational creature's participation in the divine law, and that the natural law is promulgated by the very fact that God instilled it into man's mind as to be known by him naturally. Coming more to the present Leo the 13th, following on this, he says, such is the supreme law of all, the natural law, which is imprinted and engraved in the hearts of men. So, we see the truth of natural law. We see it from sacred Scripture. I already quoted Paul's letter to the Romans. We see it from the magisterium of the Church, which is quoted Leo the 13th. We saw that the Protestant reformers of the 16th century all accepted this. We see the truth of the natural law coming from the inner testimony of our own conscience, if we're honest. And we see the truth of natural law from the testimony of all races. And the Native American Indians, even before they were evangelized, they did have a sense of right and wrong. Now, as I said, it was corrupted because of the weakness of original sin, but they did have it. Now, the natural law is denied by modern man, many of whom teach that law is nothing but what is promulgated by a legislator. It's not a law unless it's promulgated. That's called positive law. There is no law but positive law, and positive law makes it right. If it's legal, it's okay. If it's legal, it's moral. Now, this was proven false by the anti-Nazi Nuremberg trials only 60 years ago. During those trials that examined the early 1930s Nazi laws that called for the confiscation of the property of the Jews, the German court said, this is a quote, these provisions were and are, by reason of their unjust content and their violation of the basic demands of any legal order, null and void. This law could not, even at and during the time of the Nazi regime, produce any legitimate legal effect. So you see what the German court is saying these Nazi laws were not true laws because they were against the most basic demands of legal order. In other words, they were contrary to the natural law. And we bring this right up to the present. Of course, this is why the so-called laws protecting abortion are not laws at all. What is a law? Again, Aquinas tells us. 4 components. Every Catholic should get this. I've been living this myself after 12 years of Catholic school. Not only Catholics, but everybody should get this. 4 components to the law. It is a principle of reason for the common good promulgated by one who is care of the community. Again, the law, the principle of reason for the common good promulgated by one who is care of the community. Now, those are the 4 components, and if any one of these components is missing, we do not have true law. So when we look at the legalization of abortion, we're not dealing with true legislation. Any law that promotes or defends the butchering, murder of the unborn child in the mother's womb, first of all, it is not a principle of reason. For to kill innocent human life is contrary to reason. It is the nature of the man to live. It is the nature of the mother to nurture and protect her unborn baby, not to have it butchered. And secondly, it is not for the common good. The murder of innocents, the babies of the most innocent, is contrary to the common good of humanity, who first and foremost have a right to life. So even though abortion might have the other 2 components, it's promulgated in some way by one who takes care of the community, it fails because it doesn't have the first 2 components. There is no such thing as legalized abortion. The same holds true with so-called same-sex marriage, which is like trying to legalize the square circle. It's just, you can call it anything you want, it's not marriage. that it's not a principle of reason, because homosexuality itself is a moral disorder, it's contrary to nature and contrary to reason. Contrary to nature, I'm not going to go through all the biological reasons why men and women are physically compatible. I think we know. And in that physical compatibility, everything is made for the begetting and nurturing and birth of a child. That's nature. The man and the woman. It is contrary to nature of homosexuality. And it's not for the common good because it breaks down the principles of morality and marriage established by nature and given by God himself. Now, this is fun because if you run into a liberal who tries to deny natural law, you can quote one of their own heroes in defense of it. I'm going to quote this modern-day media hero who not only defends natural law, but invokes St. Thomas Aquinas in the process. Here's the quote. A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, he's quoted Aquinas now, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. Close quote. Now, who is the man who said this? This was a quotation from Dr. Martin Luther King in a letter from the Birmingham jail in 1963. Martin Luther King is invoking God's law and natural law as defined by St. Thomas Aquinas as the basis for what he claimed was his fight against racial inequality. Now, I know there are liberals who are willing to say that Aquinas is wrong. And I'm sure there are liberals who are willing to say that God is wrong. But I challenge the liberals to step forward who will say that Dr. Martin Luther King is right. So, again, as I said earlier, denying natural law is to sever yourself from 2,500 years of Western philosophical thought. It is to sever yourself from the Old Testament and the New Testament. It is to sever yourself from reality and to make of yourself a revolutionary. The denial of natural law is the product of confusion and the refuge of scoundrels. Now, I have said earlier that Barack Obama effectively denies the natural law. But before I tell you what he said, I want to mention that Professor Romano Ameria, who is one of the top, he's dead now, one of the top philosophers in Italy and Europe, actually, he explains that according to the new thinking and according to what's called the new theology, there is no longer, according to this new thinking, there's no longer any idea of the unchangeable character of natural law. Everything has to be in a state of evolution. Everything has to be in a state of flux. There are no timeless moral principles, and all facts and ethics are pretty much dismissed by reducing them to intellectual habits of thinking. What Western civilization has always regarded as immoral, modern man typically states that it's outdated taboos, and these outdated taboos, in the even of war, that mistaken notions and superstitions that it's high time we grew out of. And even modern theologians, such as Charles Curran, he will claim that natural moral law and moral rules are in continuing evolution. Now, Barack Obama, a man of no moral count, definitely subscribes to this modernist notion that morals and ethics will change over time, and that there's no such thing as a natural moral law. On October 13, 2009, Obama gave a speech to a homosexualist group called the Human Rights Campaign. He spoke to a cheering crowd of 3,000 homosexuals and homosexual sympathizers. And here Obama said, despite the real gains that we've made, there's still laws to change, still hearts to open. There are still fellow citizens, perhaps neighbors, even loved ones, good and decent people who hold fast to outworn arguments and old attitudes, who fail to see your families like their families, who would deny you the rights most Americans take for granted, and this is painful and heartbreaking. You see, Obama is doing exactly what Romano Ameria said, reducing unchangeable perennial truth, morality, to the notion of old-fashioned and irrational habits of thinking. Now, after the October 13th speech, when he vowed to repeal the Defense of Marriage Act, and the military is doing it to tell, he's on the way to doing that right now, in which we as a nation finally recognize relationships between two men or two women as just as real and admirable as relationships between a man and a woman. If we are honest with ourselves, we'll admit that there are too many who do not yet know in their lives or feel in their hearts the urgency of the struggle. That's why I continue to speak about the importance of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender families. The ones who have pregnancies like that. That's not just in front of gay audiences. And the Bible went on to say that Jesus, like the shall, have been at a point of inviting homosexual families to the White House to participate in the Easter egg roll because he said we want to send a message. So here we are in a ridiculous position of having to jump through all these hoops trying to explain to people why homosexuality is a moral disorder. Trying to explain that a homosexual couple who adopt children is not a family, it's a perversion of the entire notion of the family that was given by God himself. And I think deep down, everybody knows homosexuality is a disorder, and there's nothing to be proud of. I mean, no one I know holding their newborn son looks at them and says, I couldn't grow up to be a homosexual. What they do say is please about that, please. Even Cher, even Cher from Sonny and Cher, when she learned years ago that her daughter Crafty was a lesbian, she was when her was about 16, 17, even hip, cool, pop star Cher, she said, I totally freaked out. He recognized it as a horror film, but because of outside pressures, the godless malfunction of time, and the widespread demoralization of minds that does not talk about, she learned to accept it. Now this crafty has paid a doctor for the good age and not paying for a man. If she's not a man, she's immediately a woman. St. Thomas Aquinas forcefully condemning homosexuality because he says that all the sins that belong to lust, that which is against nature is the worst. And because St. Thomas Aquinas, he quotes Augustine. Augustine says those foul offenses that are against nature should be everywhere at all times detested and punished, such as what those people in Sodom, which salvation commit, we should all stand guilty at the same time by the law of God, who has not so made man that they should so abuse one another. And even the United States Supreme Court Justice Warren Burger, as recently as 1986, writing his opinion upholding the judge's anti-sodomy laws, he said, 86, to hold the act of homosexuality is somehow protected as a fundamental right would be to cast aside millennia of moral teaching. So we see how far we have fallen, even from 1986, but again, this is the result of the demoralized mind spoken of by Vennari, and he said, and we've already said, even if you show these people is the black and white and white and red, even if you appeal to the divine law and the moral law against homosexuality, they are unable to access to information. You are the bigot, you are the homophobe, you are still clinging to irrational and outworn moral attitudes. And you know, and this is something we have to say every time this same-sex marriage things come up, you know that the full legal recognition of homosexuality and so-called same-sex marriage ultimately cannot coexist with the legalization, the legal relation of Christianity. It can't coexist. One of them will be coerced into science. And the Christianity that is now beginning to suffer this persecution, Swedish man, Dr. Sweden, recently spent a month in jail because his homosexuality was sinful. And he evangelical, studied considerably well if he used men such pastors. What would happen to seminaries that refused to elect homosexual men, or convents that refused to elect atheists? They'll be founded by the government for so-called human rights violations. Bishop of Columbia, Catholic bishop, was already previously held in jail for refusing to allow homosexuals into the seminary. And Barack Obama is the self-proclaimed champion of subversion, religious spirit, religious Bible. But Barack Obama and the so-called Obama's so-called state school law of exemptions is a formal homosexual activity was determined to use the schools to indoctrinate your children, our children, into the alleged goodness of homosexuality. And this creature, Barack Obama, with his mind explosions of hope and pain for the ugly past, is the monster who apologizes to left hands to each other and sing amazing faith in an ecstasy of emotional exaltation in his election to the presidency. It is the end product of the demoralization and ideological subversion spoken of by the word Vesna and the burning down that's been going on, as was earlier pointed out, since at least the 1920s. So we have to fight these evils as soon as we can. Let's fight for these evils, not merely by feeling conveying of freedom or traditional values. Rather, let us be wary of what passes today for modern education. Let us reinforce the interests of the world around it. Reinforce ourselves to choose the natural law and the truth of the divine law as our moral compass. And let us explore these truths and this manner of thinking into our young adults, into our children, into a good and filled with true principles of Western civilization, work live and well, and build a Christendom centuries before Thomas Jefferson was even born. Thank you for your attention. This recording was produced by Oltyn Library Services. Visit us on the web at www.oltyn.org. That's www.oltyn.org.